Welcome to Sisters of Thunder podcast number 3. And this is really a continuation of last week where we focused on Yvette Schneider's past within both the religious rights policy groups. And today, hopefully, we'll touch a little bit on her years and maybe concerned women of America and Athletes in Action and some of the work you did there and also in Exodus. So, hello, welcome again. And if you haven't listened to weeks 1 and 2, that'll help you catch up. But Yvette's an interesting person.
Week 1 is both of us.
Week 1 is both of us.
So that's where we give our backstories.
So, but to go into this, because I think we're an interesting combination, and I've often said that if you were who you were 8 to 10 years ago, and I am who I am now, you would be one of my more formidable opponents on the other side, because you're calm in the way you answer things. You do your research. You do a lot of good research, and you're well-spoken. And I think we would have sat on a stage opposite one another, and I would have been nice to you, but you would have gotten under my skin because you're so much like me. You approach things in a moderate fashion. So sometimes when we've even been walking, I've asked Yvette, how would you have answered this question, or how would you have dealt with these different objections, which leads actually into the very first question. Well,
wait, this is what makes me laugh, is because whenever I say something I've done that Kathy considers outrageous, then it's, I'm not giving you a ride home. I'm kicking you out of the car right now.
How could like you
this
be
look
that person?
This look comes over Kathy's face of just absolute disgust, and then she has to pull herself back. No, wait, that's not.
Well, that was the other Yvette. So, in your past, in your former life, in your former jobs, you testified before you were the speaker at lots of conferences, at forums, at debates, on college campuses, before legislatures. And so tell us about that. Tell us who you've testified before and on what issues and what that felt like. I mean, what kind of strategies did you use to do that?
I remember when I spoke on hate crimes back before the Texas legislature, and one of my friends worked for the American Family Association in Texas. So she asked me to come. She was actually
this is one of those times I may throw you out the front door now. No.
This was the close friend of my roommate at the time. And my roommate at the time was Kathy Cleaver, now known as Kathy Cleaver Roos, who works for Family Research Council still, whose husband is Austin Roos, who Kathy can probably give more of his background than I can.
They mentioned him in that book, Republican Gomorrah, too, which I think is a fascinating book.
Yes. So there was a huge circus. It was crazy when I spoke in Texas, when I went to speak on hate crimes. And this is right before
So you were
George
speaking
Bush.
To not have them...
This was a Senate hearing. And we did not want hate crimes legislation to pass.
To include
anyone, really. We were not for hate crimes. No hate crimes legislation, and this is why. And I'll give you some background on this. Okay, so this was
really
a
sounds
Senate
immoral.
Hearing. This was a Senate hearing. This is right before George Bush was running for president. And this would, if it got to his desk, it would be very bad, because then he would either have to sign it or not. So it was up to us to make sure it didn't get to his desk. And there was one swing vote. This is how it played out. This is after James Byrd.
So you don't want this potentially future president to have had made this very public decision about we don't need hate crimes because that would play out bad in the media.
Right.
Obviously.
Yes. We didn't want him to have to take a strong stand like that or be in the position where he would have to take a strong stand. So, and the people who had sponsored the bill knew this. Because one of the first questions they asked me, well, before I get to that, the room was packed. And this is right after, or not too long after, James Byrd had been dragged to death by those men behind the pickup truck, and his family was there.
Wow.
And the argument there is, I sat with them sitting right over my left shoulder and said, these men are heinous in what they did, but they have been punished. When you're talking life in prison or the death penalty, how much greater of a punishment can you have? It's not as if they were not punished. It's not as if they were let go. What would you need hate crimes legislation for?
Like, how much more could you punish them?
If you get the death penalty, are you going to be killed twice? How would that work? And then, so the room was filled with people, all for the hate crimes law. There were only like 4 of us.
Oh my goodness.
And this hearing went on for hours and hours and hours. And the other side went first. And I sat there for hours, nervous, because I knew there were Texas citizens who were coming up and speaking. But here I was coming from Washington, D.C. to come and speak on this. So when I got up there, that is the first thing they jumped on was, what are you doing here? Well, actually, the first thing that happened was a lot of the senators weren't even in the room. They were off. One of the senators had this big chicken dinner going on for all the people who he had invited to come and speak. So they'd speak and then they'd go and have their chicken dinner. So I'm speaking to almost no one, but the one who was in there was the swing voter and a couple others who were opposed to the law. They were sitting there. Well, I saw one of the pages run out when I started speaking to go and get the sponsors of the bill to come back in. Mm-hmm. And because once they found out who I was, they all came filing back in so that they could fire questions at me. And my point was, look, I used to be gay. And they said, is that what this is about? And I said, no, just let me finish what I'm saying. This has nothing to do with if people can change or not. When I was gay, if someone had raped me, would it have been more heinous than if someone rapes me now, even though I'm the exact same person? So you are creating a hierarchy of victims with a law like this. You're going to say that my life was worth more as a lesbian than it is as a straight woman. And the swing voter said, you're making some very compelling points, and you could just see the whole thing shift at that point. And it died, and at that point, hate crimes legislation died. But it was, how could you punish these murderers more than they were punished?
Wow.
You can't.
I don't even know what I would say to you without practicing beforehand.
Well, you know what you would say to me, and no one said this, but law isn't just for criminalizing something. It is also, and has been used historically, to set examples. Mm-hmm. You cannot single out these particular people for a crime. Mm-hmm. I could have answered myself then. And that is why I ended up with the anxiety I had, because I could see both sides. I could see the side that would say, well, wait a minute. Law needs to set an example. You have to say, no, it's not okay to single out people who have traditionally been looked down upon, who have traditionally been treated poorly.
When I was in college, I went to Rutgers during the mid and late 70s, and there was a place right on College Avenue, right at the main part of the campus. Big campus, 45,000 people. So not a little backwater college where people kind of hung out and skulked around in bushes, but it was known that gay men used to cruise College Avenue. So just in the time we were talking about last week, people just coming out. But there's still a lot of a shame attached to it. And men would drive College Avenue and try to pick someone up in the cars. And it was really well known that a lot of the frats were right there on College Avenue. And I remember knowing that some of those frat boys were going out. I mean, the weapon of choice at the time was baseball bats, right? And they would go out and they would drag the gay men out of the cars and they would beat them. And because they would know, first of all, the gay men wouldn't prosecute because they wouldn't want to be caught as gay, but there was no huge penalty for these crimes. That people were not paying the price for specifically targeting for gay people, and now transgender people are being specifically targeted. So it's just really interesting that you have been on that side of the conversation, but you also could know how to answer that. So when you've gone to college campuses, how did that go? I mean, you've been to some Ivy League college campuses speaking for the religious right, haven't you?
I have, and I went to Dartmouth. This was back in the early 2000s, and the student body was very upset because I did not get an honorarium. I didn't get a fee. It had nothing to do with that, just so everyone knows. But they were paying my hotel, which was just a regular
Dartmouth,
hotel.
like
Dartmouth
Student Union. Okay.
was paying for that, and for my trip up there, my flight there and back. And the students were enraged because they're paying for me, this anti-LGBT activist, pro-family activist, to come to their school. So that's why it was so outrageous. Some college campuses, the Christian groups that invited me, paid. But here, the student body was paying.
And what was the intention of the forum?
So I had been invited by a Christian group on campus, and they just wanted the student body to hear that someone who used to be gay wasn't anymore. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to get into a big debate about any sort of legislation. It was just all about come and tell us your story. And I thought, well, that's easy.
So if someone hasn't heard these, a podcast, the first one, so they'll hear these sentences that you say, I used to be gay, and that will ruffle feathers because we know that people, whatever orientation they are that orientation. How do you validate a sentence like that now?
Well, I assume that you mean talking about me personally.
Right.
So I look at it now that I had attractions to both genders all along, and that nothing's really changed. I wouldn't call, I always feel like I'm backed into a corner and have to call myself bisexual when really I don't want to label myself at all.
Which is a common response.
Yeah,
right.
I really don't feel comfortable with a label. But, I am married. I have been married for 16 years now to a man. I plan on staying that way. I still have same-sex attractions. They're not some overwhelming, life-dominating attraction. I don't have the desire to be in a relationship with a woman. I'm married. I'm happily married. I really don't know how else to describe it other than that.
Right, and I think that's the kind of thing that wrangles people because, there's one of these podcasts we are going to talk about bisexuality. We're going to talk about Dr. Lisa Diamond and her findings, which are fascinating about women.
Her work is spectacular because she covers every single angle, and because it's finally something that's about women in particular, it's gold.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Her book really is gold. So
So
I
back
hope
to Dartmouth.
that answers at least enough of your question right now.
Right, because it's just if someone's only listening to one and they hear you say, I used to be gay.
Now I'm not anymore.
Right.
Yeah, no, basically nothing's changed.
Right.
I'm exactly as
But
I've
the way
always
you would have
been.
presented it then
Right.
would have been in the context of I used to be gay and now I'm not.
Right, because I had had lesbian relationships and then I didn't anymore. Mm-hmm. And it had all to do, it was all to do with behavior.
Right. Right.
I don't do that behavior anymore.
Right.
I do this behavior now.
Right. And I know you to be a happily married woman. I know Paul. I think he's fabulous because he's an engineer, and so was I. So, and I know some days like Yvette will shake her head at me like, ugh. Paul is the same way. Like, you engineers are the same way. I mean, I may not have been working in it for 20 years, but I guess I've got some of that ingrained in me, that determination, that list-making stuff.
Your engineer orientation.
Yes, no, it's my engineering preference.
You prefer.
Yeah. So back then to Dartmouth.
So before I even got there, they were writing in the paper about how I shouldn't come, and there was all this turmoil.
The year 2000, what?
2001.
Okay.
Something like that. It was one or the other. So I go up there, and they have me set up to speak in an auditorium. And there are people picketing outside.
Nice.
I meet with people who picked me up from the airport, which you can't just fly into Dartmouth. It's
Right.
like you fly in, and then there's a 2-hour drive, and you're out in the middle of nowhere.
Nice.
So I'm with these Christian students who they're on edge too, because they've been seeing the fury of the student body. So I'm expected to come in and sort of calm them down.
And you are the only
Everything's gonna be
speaker for
okay.
them.
I'm the only speaker. I went by myself. I'm the only speaker that night. They have this auditorium. People are picketing with signs. And what did Jesus say about homosexuality? And be blank. They're handing out these.
I would have been there.
These tracts, yeah, and it says, and they're folded in half, and on the front it says, what did Jesus say about homosexuality? And then you open it up, and it's completely blank inside.
Right.
That's the stuff they're handing out. So I'm sitting in the front row of this auditorium theater, waiting, and people are chattering and whispering and talking. Well, there wasn't enough space for everyone to come in.
Oh, no.
And students were upset. If we paid for her to come, we deserve to be able to hear what she has to say.
We deserve to be within throwing distance.
Yeah. We need to be inside. So in a panic, there are administrators in a panic, the students who invited me are in a panic. Would it be okay if we move the venue? I said,
To the football
fine,
stadium.
whatever. So does Dartmouth even play football?
Oh.
So this is not a big school. So they moved to, I want to say it was the cafeteria. Did they have cafeterias? I don't know. But they did. And they moved all the tables, whatever was in there, they moved them. So it was just this linoleum floor. And everyone sat on the floor. The administrators, they dragged in chairs, but the students, that was the only way to fit everyone.
Wow.
And I just stood there in front of the students who were up practically to my feet. So it was a little unnerving. We're all packed into this room. And I just told my story. My Christian story. I was gay, and then I got saved, and then this happened, and I'm not gay anymore. And this girl gets up afterwards, because of course there's a Q&A, and she said, that's all very benign. But
What a Dartmouth response,
exactly,
right?
I'll never forget it. It's all very benign. But
I'm going to use that on you.
I read an interview that you did with Americans for Truth. So Pete LaBarbara's organizations, and Pete and I worked together at FRC, where you said that AIDS is a punishment from God for homosexuals. And I said, I never said that. And I knew what I said. And that was, I had 17 friends who died of AIDS. And I began looking at my life, this was before I became a Christian, wanting some sort of security to it. It's because I had said it that way that my friends dying of AIDS caused me to pause and look at my life.
Right.
They took it to mean you think AIDS is a punishment from God. When first of all, I didn't even believe in God at the time. And by pausing to look at my life, it was, where am I going? I am under 30 years old and my friends are dying and I'm scared. I need some sort of security in my life. I need a family. I need a place to call home. I think anyone could understand that under those circumstances, you're going to be terrified. Well, that I'm trying to explain this, and there's this guy sitting, because everyone's sitting, and he's got this big poster that says Liometer. It's got this dial on it. So he puts the dial all the way over into the red that I'm lying. And of course I believed AIDS is a punishment from God, which of course I did not believe that. I've never believed that in my life. I think we've even talked about that before. And if it were, then why would God only be punishing the men and not the women?
Right.
Because that was the big joke back in those days when AIDS was really ripping through the gay community, was that lesbians then must be his chosen people. Because it was so hard to transmit HIV between two women.
So how effective was your time?
I didn't think this. So these students are yelling at me. Finally, someone stands up, I don't know who it was, and said, "Let her talk." And they start yelling at each other. So the campus security comes in, who were actually campus police. And they were standing over by the back door. And he came up to me and said, "Now would be a good time to leave." And he took me in his squad car and drove me to the campus police station, where I waited until someone came to pick me up.
Wow.
And then the debate continued after I left. I spoke to the Christian group the next day, and we spoke. But then in the newspaper, it was, where is public opinion now on this after this event has taken place? Well, then a Christian group at Princeton wrote, "We wouldn't have been this rude. We're a much more polite Ivy than Dartmouth."
Right.
And that's where it went down that road. But it really felt like, okay, that you could hear a pin drop when I spoke. And that's the way it was at every college campus I spoke at. No one ever interrupted me when I was speaking. No one ever yelled out. Everyone was, and I think it was because I did have a very compelling story and people hadn't heard this before. But again, it was all about behavior.
Right.
And it had nothing to do with changing orientation or attractions or anything like that.
So obviously you were very effective at your job within HR, within FRC. But maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see lots of respect coming from the religious right starting in the 70s when I came of age, when Phyllis Schlafly struck down the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, the Equal Rights Amendment, the United States has been trying to pass it since 1923. And, obviously times have changed, and you would think that a prime time to pass the Equal Rights Amendment might have been in the 1970s during the feminist movement, and it was struck down. So I don't see the religious right being particularly respectful or deferential to women in general, and that may be my old holdover, but obviously they gave you space and deference within their organization to speak for them. What do you think of the attitudes of just women in general, not like you were their coworker, but the laws they're trying to pass in the country now that they're all behind, of limiting birth control and limiting abortion facilities. And that's a whole nother topic, but they're very tied to women and women's rights, and men are making these decisions. What was your impression about the opinions and the status of women in those years?
Well, it's interesting because I worked in a department called Cultural Studies at Family Research Council, and I was the only woman. My boss was Bob Knight. I worked with the numbers sometimes fluctuated, but it was usually 4 other men, Bob, myself, and I was the only woman there. So sometimes, and I was respected completely. I was never looked down upon.
I mean, I can't imagine anyone treating you any other way.
Ever.
Right.
Ever. Not at all. I considered the people that I worked with like family, and they treated me the same way. And because of that, I think because we had such a great comfort level, things were said that may not have been under other circumstances. And that was one day I walked up on a conversation where, 2 of the men were bemoaning that women had the right to vote and saying the whole problem with our country is that women have the right to vote because they're so easily influenced by gay friends, by emotions and relationships, and that they fail to act out or make decisions out of reason and rational trains of thought, but that it was all emotion. And that if women didn't have the right to vote, we wouldn't be in the trouble that we're in.
Darn. Boy, we should just keep the dominant group in dominance.
But
works so well.
Ann Coulter said the same thing about women. That women shouldn't have the right to vote because they're making decisions based upon emotion.
It's amazing.
And that they don't know how to handle money. That was hers also.
Wow. So we're coming near the end of this one, and I still want to talk about time at Exodus, and I also want to talk about the religious right going into other countries. But so let's try to wrap up this one. And once again, I'm trying to keep. I really don't understand how people within the religious right cannot understand the concept that families want to be protected. And you said, I think it might have been last week, that they see all gays the same way. And it's really difficult for me to understand that somebody, and you also talked about scratching in the dark corners and seeing what came up, that how could anybody equate, like I wouldn't equate a heterosexual that was hanging out at the bars and picking a heterosexual man that was hanging out at the bars and picking up a different woman each night of the weekend with a family man that stayed at home with his wife and children. I mean, I would never equate those as the same. But somehow all gays get lumped together.
But if you look at, and you have Romans 1, where they're given over, they've decided to be gay, and they're given over to their lusts, then all homosexuality is lust. That's how they read that.
Right.
That scripture. That's how they read that scripture.
And in week
it's all lust.
5 of our webinar that we're doing, and those are also archived too on the same website, Sisters of Thunder. But in week 5, we talk about what Romans 1 really says. But if you are reading it from that point of view, and I know from my years of evangelicalism, I mean, and I consider myself a conservative evangelical Christian, I now don't hold things in the same hierarchy. But if I thought something was the truth, the Word of God, it held a dominant space over relationships. So I don't know what I would have done in those years if my children came out as gay. I would probably do what a lot of parents do, is hold the truth that God says there's something wrong with this over the relationship with my own children, which I know people do, because I would hold that truth in the highest position.
Because God comes first.
Right, because God comes first, and that's a very honorable position. And I had an occasion with a young woman that used to work for me when I had I had a family business, and this young woman named Lori worked for me while she was in college. And she did junior high Bible studies with me. And years later, 10 years later, she came out as a lesbian. And, and now I'm doing this work, so of course she thinks I'm wonderful. But I said to her, we were so close. Why did you never come out and tell me you were a lesbian during those years? And she has said to me, Kathy, you were the best Christian I knew. You were the most devout Christian I knew. And I knew that if I told you, you would tell me the truth, that you were completely unmovable, and that you would have told me I had to change. And when I had to really look at that and be honest about myself, I can understand how people on the religious right really are, because if I really have to sit within myself during those years, I know I would have, no matter how much I loved this young woman and respected her and led studies with her, I would have told her the truth and risked relationship.
Right, because if you believe that the Bible is the true, inspired, inerrant Word of God, and that this is unequivocally what it says.
That's the big problem, is what does the Bible say? So we won't get into that in a podcast, but week 5 of our webinar does get into that, and it's very clear that it's not talking about, and if you go back to week 1 and 2, we wouldn't have understood the concept of mutually attracted, same status, committed, loving relationships any time before about the 1920s, 30s, really 1970s. So how could Romans be talking about that? So when we hold that as a truth, when we say that Romans 1 is saying that, all these other things from the religious right, from Yvette version 1.0, from Tony Perkins today, from the parents that are turning their children out, this is understandable. And this is why we do what we do, so that we can talk about what those things really say in the context and the consequences, today even, of misinterpreting those scriptures.
I have some very intelligent friends who are gay orientation, who are trying not to be gay, and who have come to me, okay, why did you change? What happened? And they want to talk scripture with me, and I do. But this is what I tell them also. Once we've had those discussions, I say, you need to study this for yourself. You have to just stop listening to what other people tell you. You're intelligent. You can figure this out yourself. These are the books that you need to read.
Yeah.
These are, and read them from both sides. Read the ones that the other side has published, and read these, and Kathy will tell you what they are, because it's important to be informed yourself.
Yeah, and the order I always say is Justin Lee's Torn, so that you can have some compassion and understand. My book, Walking the Bridges Canyon, because it's such a good contextual history. Then I say Matthew Vine's book, God and the Gay Christian. Then I say James Brownson's book for the next level of theology, Bible, Gender, Sexuality. And then David Gushie's book, Changing Our Minds. And when you do read those in context with the other books, and if you even do like I do, I read so much of the other side. I have another one coming tomorrow. I read so much of the other side. And when I outline them, or I do a good job of highlighting and trying to understand them, it becomes pretty clear to me who has some really cogent arguments. And you just have to think about what you're reading. And the other thing is, you have to think about what you're hearing. So when you're hearing from if what you're hearing is fear and destruction, as opposed to love and life, that should give a good indication of which is more aligned with the heart of God and the example of Jesus. So if you're constantly hearing condemnation and the fruit of the words of a group are destructive to another group of people, You have to start taking those things apart and just even being comfortable with saying, I might be wrong about these things. You've had to do it. I've had to do it. I think we were both absolute, Yvette, true believers on the other side.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Completely. So we'll pick this up. It'll be, I guess it's Yvette month.
That part 3.
Yvette month. And it's not even it is your birthday next month. So it is Yvette month. Yay. And you will be 50. Yay.
Yay.
Next year I will be 60. So there's some kind of parties going on here. Woohoo. So once again, thank you for listening to us. We are Kathy and Yvette, and we are the Thank You Butch Maltby Sisters of Thunder. And this is podcast number 3. And next week we'll be talking about, I think we'll get to it, both Exodus and the religious right as they go into other countries, which is fascinating in itself. So thanks for listening to us, and we'll be back next week. Bye.
Bye.